carriers of the cordyceps brain infection first arrived in the United States of America during the autumn of 2013. By the end of the year, many of the nation's cities had been quarantined, a desperate attempt to protect the remaining uninfected population. Today, these cities represent the last vestiges of the United States, small pockets of civilization surrounded by a vast and hostile wilderness. The Pittsburgh quarantine zone is not one of them. As martial law was declared across the country and the Federal Disaster Response Agency took control of local governments, Pittsburgh was designated a military-controlled quarantine zone. Movement in or out of the city was strictly regulated and eventually blocked altogether. Surrounding suburbs and districts were carpet-bombed in an ultimately futile attempt to kill the ever-increasing number of infected and establish buffer zones around the city. Surviving elements of the Pennsylvania National Guard and other disparate personnel from the United States military became the highest authority within the quarantine zone. As the situation outside the city deteriorated, they employed ever more oppressive methods to contain and subdue the healthy civilian population. Freedom of assembly was erased, and summary executions replaced due process, for without the supplies necessary to test for infection, suspected individuals were shot on sight. When outside supplies stopped coming, the situation in the Pittsburgh quarantine zone grew untenable. Without sufficient rations, civilians and military personnel alike grew restless and volatile. The Fireflies, a growing militia opposed to military oppression, saw in Pittsburgh a chance to overthrow a tyrannical regime and spurred the local population to action. But the revolution they incited quickly grew beyond their control, spiraling into 14 months of cruelty and violence. Hundreds were gunned down. Soldiers were doused in gasoline and set alight. Mob rule replaced martial law. Lacking the resolve to stay and fight, military personnel abandoned the city in droves. Those who remained awaited orders and help from their superiors in Atlanta, but when their last line of communications was severed, they too were overwhelmed and massacred. This uprising, however, merely replaced one form of tyrannical rule with another. The most cunning and brutal members of the rebellion had achieved through their triumph a place of prominence, becoming the new leaders of the quarantine zone. They rejected and turned on the Fireflies, who in their eyes had done nothing to contribute to the success of the revolt. The decline of the Pittsburgh quarantine zone into unrestrained savagery came quickly. Those deemed not to have contributed enough in the fight against the military were killed or banished. The first in a line of scapegoats and show trials. The highest law in the zone was made clear when a group of teenagers murdered a family of refugees that had taken shelter in Pittsburgh. During a public trial, it was declared they had acted in the best interest of the group, and all should follow their example. Those who refused were killed. In the years since, Pittsburgh has become a lure in the shape of a city. Any wanderer who gazes at its skyline will see the familiar sights of overgrown ruins, toppled skyscrapers, forgotten storehouses, and treasure troves that might be brimming with forgotten rations or overlooked supplies. If desperate enough to enter, they will walk past abandoned cars and rusted wrecks, never noticing the many eyes watching them from the towers above. When the time is right, when the wanderer is lost in a maze of ruined buildings, they will be approached by a man, seemingly wounded, pleading for help, and then the hunt will begin.
In Atlas, the Templin Institute investigates the most storied places from across alternate worlds. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to join the Templin Institute, consider pledging to our Patreon page. Along with increased security access, you'll be able to vote in polls to determine future topics, get custom wallpaper every week, and receive some other exclusive rewards.